I came to the bank to pay a $6,000 debt for my house, but the cashier went pale and said, "Ma'am, look at your balance." There was $31 million. I had never seen that kind of money and had always lived in debt. When I found out... Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Caroline Marsh, and for most of my adult life, I believe that struggling was simply what people like me did. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house where the heat got turned off every February because the bill came due right after Christmas, when there was never anything left. My mother worked 2 jobs, a diner in the morning, a laundromat in the evenings, and she still couldn't keep us ahead of the calendar. I watched her clip coupons at the kitchen table under a single bulb, and I told myself I would be different. I told myself I would be smarter, more careful, more disciplined. I wasn't. Life has a way of teaching you that discipline alone doesn't reroute the river. I married Dennis Marsh at 28. He was charming in the particular way of men who want you to notice how charming they are. Always the loudest laugh at the table, always the one who ordered a second round for everyone else and then quietly asked you to cover it later. I told myself it was generosity. It took me years to understand it was performance. We settled in a modest house in the suburbs of Columbus. Dennis worked in logistics, middle management, a title that sounded more substantial than the paycheck it produced. I worked as a dental office administrator, and we managed. Barely. Every month was a negotiation between what we owed and what we had, and the balance never quite tipped in our favor. His mother, Patricia Marsh, lived 20 minutes away, and she made sure we never forgot it. She was a compact, precise woman with silver hair she kept tightly pinned, and she spoke to me always with that particular brand of politeness that contains no warmth whatsoever, the kind that says, "I am enduring you." Dennis said I was too sensitive. I learned to be quiet about Patricia. The years passed the way they do when you're tired. Our daughter Emma was born, then our son Jake. The mortgage on the house grew heavier, not lighter. I took on a part-time bookkeeping job on weekends. Dennis took on golf. By the time I was 43, we owed $6,000 in deferred mortgage payments, a backlog that had accumulated over 8 months of careful triage, paying the electricity first, then the car insurance, then trying to catch the bank up. I had finally saved enough to wipe it clean. It felt like a small victory, the kind that only people who have known real scarcity understand. Not triumph, but relief, which is the poor person's version of triumph. It was a Tuesday in March when I drove to the branch on Henderson Road. I remember the weather, overcast, the kind of gray that makes everything look slightly used. I wore my good coat, the navy wool one I'd bought at a consignment shop 3 years earlier. I wanted to look like someone paying a debt, not someone drowning in one. The teller was a young man named Kevin, according to his name badge. He had the pleasant practice blankness of someone trained to make transactions feel invisible. I slid my account information across the counter and told him I wanted to apply $6,000 to my mortgage account. He typed. He typed some more, and then he stopped. His face did something I will never forget. It didn't collapse into alarm. It simply drained. Color left it the way water leaves a bathtub, steadily, completely, until there was nothing left but pale. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had gone careful in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Could you look at this for a moment?" He turned the screen toward me slightly, just enough that I could read it. The account number was mine. The name was mine. Caroline A. Marsh, and the balance displayed was $31,400,208.17. I stared at it. My brain did what brains do when they encounter something that doesn't belong in the world they have constructed. It rejected it. I thought there had been a mistake. I thought he had pulled up the wrong account. I even thought, in one absurd half-second, that I had misread it, that I was seeing things the way you sometimes see shapes in static. "That's not right," I said. "It's your account number," Kevin said quietly. "It's your name." "That can't be my balance." "Ma'am." He lowered his voice. "You should speak with a manager." I sat down in one of the chairs by the window without being told to. Outside, cars moved through the gray afternoon. A woman pushed a stroller past the glass. Everything looked exactly as it always had, and inside my chest, something had begun to crack open. Something I didn't have a name for yet. Something between terror and the very first edge of a question I was afraid to finish asking. How does a woman who can barely make her mortgage payment end up with $31 million in her bank account? And beneath that question, quieter, sharper, who put it there? And why didn't anyone tell me? The branch manager's name was Linda Okafor, and she was the kind of woman who had seen enough to stay professionally calm through almost anything. But even she paused when she pulled up my account on her office computer. Her pause lasted only a second, one controlled, almost imperceptible breath. And then she was composed again, folding her hands on the desk with the deliberateness of someone choosing every movement. "Mrs. Marsh," she said, "I'm going to need to ask you a few questions, and I want you to answer them honestly because what I'm looking at is flagged by our compliance system." "Flagged," I repeated. "A transfer of this size, multiple transfers actually, over the past 4 months, would have triggered automatic reporting. We're required by law to notify the IRS and FinCEN of transactions over $10,000. This is considerably over $10,000. My mouth felt dry. I didn't make any transfers. She looked at me steadily. The transfers came from an external trust account. The account is registered under the name of a Raymond Calloway, deceased. Do you know that name? I did, but just barely, and from so long ago that it took me a moment to locate the memory. Raymond Calloway had been my mother's older brother, her estranged older brother, a man I had met exactly twice as a child. He had lived in Phoenix, worked in real estate, and accumulated, from what little my mother had said about him, a comfortable amount of money. He had also, apparently, never forgiven our side of the family for something I was never told the full story of. He died, I thought, sometime around 2019. I remembered my mother calling me, her voice flat with a grief she didn't want to admit. "Uncle Ray passed," she said. "There won't be a service. He didn't want one." "He was my great uncle," I told Linda Okafor. "He passed away a few years ago, but I was never in contact with him. We weren't close." "His estate," Linda said carefully, "appears to have designated you as a beneficiary. The transfers began flowing 4 months ago from a trust account managed by a firm in Phoenix." She slid a printout across the desk. "I'd strongly recommend you contact an estate attorney before you touch a single dollar of this money, and I'd also recommend you find out exactly what was in his will and whether you were the only named beneficiary." I drove home in a daze. Emma was at school, Jake was at a friend's house, Dennis was at work, or so he said. The house felt enormous and silent in the way that houses only feel when you've just learned something that rewrites the floor plan of your life. I sat at the kitchen table. The same table where I'd clipped coupons, where I'd calculated how to stretch a paycheck across 14-line items of debt. And I opened my laptop. It took me less than an hour of searching to find the first anomaly. Raymond Calloway's estate had been settled through a probate court in Maricopa County, Arizona. The records were public. I found the case number, I found the filing date, March 2020, and I found the name of the estate attorney, a firm called Brecker and Associates in Phoenix. But I also found something else. Buried in the procedural filings, in language so dry and bureaucratic it almost slid past me, was a notation that the primary beneficiary designation had been contested. Someone had attempted to redirect the estate funds. The challenge had been filed and then withdrawn, and the name attached to the challenge was not mine. It was Patricia Marsh, my mother-in-law. I closed the laptop. I sat very still. I thought about all the times Patricia had found excuses to go through Dennis's paperwork at our house. I thought about the time she'd asked me, seemingly idly, whether I had any family in Arizona. I thought about the Christmas 3 years ago when she had been inexplicably, almost aggressively kind to me for about 2 weeks, and then returned to her usual temperature. She had known. She had known about Raymond Calloway's estate. She had known I was named in his will, and she had tried to contest it. And when that failed, she'd said nothing. Not to the attorneys. Not to me. Not to anyone who might have told me. For how long had she been sitting on that knowledge? And what, exactly, had Dennis known? That night, after I put the kids to bed, I called my college friend Dana Sorrento. Dana was a paralegal in a family law firm downtown, and she was the kind of person who answered the phone after 10 p.m. without complaint. "I need the name of a good estate attorney," I said, "and a good divorce attorney, preferably someone who can be both." There was a silence on Dana's end. "Caroline," she said slowly, "what happened?" "I'm not sure yet," I said, "but I think someone stole 4 years of my life from me, and I'm going to find out exactly how much it cost." That was the first night I slept with a plan instead of just a fear. It didn't feel like courage. Not yet. It felt like the cold, specific clarity that arrives when you finally stop waiting to understand something and simply decide to act. Dana came through, as she always did. His name was Robert Hensley, estate attorney, 22 years in practice, an office in a Victorian row house on Fifth Avenue that smelled of old paper and lemon polish. He was in his late 50s, deliberate in the way of people who had stopped needing to perform competence and had simply become it. He listened to everything I said without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The fact that the transfers have already reached your account is actually advantageous," he said. "It means the trust executed. Whatever challenge Patricia Marsh filed in 2020, she failed. What she may have succeeded in doing, and this is what I need to verify, is delaying your notification." Can she legally do that? Not unilaterally, but with cooperation from someone inside the probate process, a distant trustee, an attorney who wasn't paying attention, a family member who had access to the contact information on file and ensured it stayed wrong. It's possible to slow things down considerably. He looked at me carefully. "Do you know how the trust had your contact information on file?" I thought about it. I moved twice in the last 10 years. Once before I was married, once after. And who would have known both addresses? The answer arrived before I wanted it to. "Dennis," I said, "and Patricia." Robert Hensley nodded slowly. He recommended I do nothing visible. No confrontations, no account transfers, no conversations with Dennis or Patricia. while he began the process of requesting the full probate record from Maricopa County. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel. I had learned in the years of managing a household that never quite balanced how to keep my face neutral when I was frightened. I used that skill now. Dennis was in the kitchen when I came in, heating something on the stove. He glanced at me with the distracted half-attention he had given me for years, the look that meant he was present but not quite there, like a radio playing in another room. "You're late," he said. "Errands," I said. He nodded and turned back to the stove. He didn't ask which errands. He never did anymore. I watched him for a moment. This man I had built a life with, this man who had stood beside me in a church at 28 and promised things. And I tried to read his face for something. Guilt, maybe, or knowledge. But Dennis had always been good at the performance of normalcy. It was one of his most reliable skills. 10 days later, Robert Hensley called me into his office. He had received the records. He laid them on the desk between us with the care of someone presenting evidence, not paperwork. "There are 2 things I want you to see," he said. The first was a document showing the original beneficiary notification sent by Brecker and Associates in Phoenix, the firm managing Raymond Calloway's estate. It had been sent to an address in Columbus, a P.O. box on the east side of the city that I had never rented, never opened, and never heard of. Someone had provided that P.O. box address as my contact information to the estate attorney. The notification letters, 4 of them over 2 years, had gone there. And because there had been no response, the estate had moved slowly, waiting for contact that never came. "Who provided that address?" I asked, though I already knew. Robert turned to the second document. It was an intake form filled out by the estate's initial contact representative, a form used to gather current contact information for beneficiaries. At the bottom, in a field labeled "Information provided by," someone had written a name, Dennis R. Marsh, my husband's handwriting, his signature, dated June 2020. I sat very still, the office around me, the shelves of casebooks, the framed diplomas, the afternoon light coming through the tall windows. All of it seemed to pull into sharp relief, the way things do when your entire recent history is rearranging itself into a new and terrible shape. Dennis had known about the inheritance. He had been contacted by the estate attorneys, perhaps through Patricia, perhaps directly, and he had given them a false address. He had intercepted the notifications. For 4 years, while I worked weekends doing bookkeeping and clipped coupons and lay awake calculating mortgage arrears, my husband had known I was the heir to $31 million, and he had made sure I didn't find out. "This is fraud," I said. "It is," Robert said. He was watching me with quiet steadiness. "And it's provable." What kind of man watches his wife struggle for 4 years, watches her cry over bills, watches her run herself into exhaustion, and says nothing? I didn't answer my own question out loud, but sitting in that chair, holding that document with my husband's handwriting on it, I felt something inside me complete its turning. Not rage. Something colder and more useful than rage. Certainty. Robert and I spent 3 sessions over the following 2 weeks mapping the strategy. He brought in a colleague named Sandra Pruitt, a family law specialist with a reputation for precision and an office even more austere than his. Together they outlined what we were going to do, and they did it in the calm, procedural language of people who had fought these battles before and knew exactly where each stone in the path was laid. The plan had 3 simultaneous tracks. First, a fraud complaint filed with the Maricopa County Probate Court, documenting Dennis's falsification of my contact information and the resulting 4-year delay in my inheritance notification. Second, a divorce filing in Franklin County, Ohio, citing grounds that included financial fraud and concealment of marital assets. Third, a formal protective order on my accounts, ensuring that the $31 million could not be touched, transferred, or contested while litigation was pending. I signed every document with the same hand that used to sign overdue notices. The protective order was filed on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, Dennis knew. He came into the bedroom at 7 a.m. I was already awake, had been for hours, and he set his phone on the nightstand face up, which was how I knew he wanted me to see what was on it. It was an email from his own attorney, 2 sentences acknowledging service of the divorce filing. "You want to tell me what this is?" he said. His voice was even. That was always the warning sign with Dennis. Not when he raised his voice, but when he kept it perfectly level, like a pressure valve holding. "I think it's self-explanatory," I said. "Caroline?" He sat on the edge of the bed. He used the particular posture of a man who is trying to look reasonable, shoulders squared, hands open on his knees. "You need to understand what you're doing here. You're blowing up our family over a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," I repeated. "I was trying to protect you." The estate was complicated. There were tax implications. There were questions about the trust structure. My mother thought it would be better handled quietly before we brought you in. We were going to tell you. We. He had said we. He had not even tried to separate himself from Patricia. "You gave them a P.O. box that wasn't mine," I said. "You signed a form in June 2020. The evenness slipped, just slightly. "That can be explained. I'm sure your attorney will try." He stood. The performance of reasonableness ended. "You're making a serious mistake," he said, and his voice had changed. It had the particular flatness of a man issuing a warning dressed as a statement. "My mother has resources you don't understand. She has relationships with people who managed Raymond's estate for years. You think one attorney in Columbus is going to outmaneuver that? You think a judge is going to believe—" "Dennis," I said quietly, "get out of my bedroom." He left. But 20 minutes later, as I was making coffee in the kitchen, Patricia's car pulled into the driveway. She came in without knocking. She had always come in without knocking, a small dominance she had maintained for 15 years. And she stood in the kitchen doorway with her silver hair pinned and her coat buttoned, and she looked at me the way she always had, as though I were a problem she had never quite solved. "I think we should talk," she said. "I think you should speak with my attorney," I said. Her eyes didn't change. "You are going to lose," she said, and the pleasantness she had always worn like a coat was simply gone. She hadn't bothered to bring it. "You don't have the background for this kind of fight. You don't have the connections. And if you push this into a courtroom, I will make sure that every financial decision you've made in the last 15 years is examined. Every late payment, every overdraft, every desperate little measure. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Perfectly," I said. She held my gaze for a long moment and then, because there was nothing left to say and she knew it, she turned and left. After she was gone, I stood at the kitchen counter for a while, looking out at the driveway where her car had been. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that specifically, the way you notice your own steadiness when you expect it to fall apart. That weekend, I drove to a small bed and breakfast in Hocking Hills, 2 hours south. I took nothing but a bag, a novel I didn't read, and my phone, which I checked only twice a day. I walked trails. I ate meals slowly. I slept more than I had in years. I gave myself 3 days to be quiet before the next round began, because I knew it would come. I came back from Hocking Hills on a Monday evening, and the house felt different. Not because anything in it had changed, but because I had. Something had settled in me during those 3 days among the sandstone ridges and the November bare trees. I can't call it peace exactly, because what lay ahead was not peaceful, but it was something close to groundedness, the knowledge of where I stood and the willingness to stand there. Dennis had moved some of his clothing to the guest room while I was gone. He hadn't said anything to me about it, and I hadn't said anything to him. We moved through the house like two objects on parallel tracks, visible to each other but not intersecting. On Wednesday, he knocked on the door frame of the kitchen while I was eating breakfast. He looked tired, or rather, he had arranged his face into tiredness. Dennis had always been good at deploying emotion strategically, and I was only now understanding how long I had read his performances as the real thing. "I've been thinking," he said. I said nothing. "There's a way to handle this that doesn't destroy both of us. Half of that money, legally in a divorce settlement, it's marital. The attorneys will tell you the same thing, but if we go to court, a third of it goes to fees. A third of the timeline goes to waiting. Emma and Jake watched their parents fight for 2 years. He paused. "I'm willing to talk. A real conversation. No attorneys in the room." It was a reasonable-sounding offer. It was structured to sound reasonable. I could see the architecture of it, the way you can see a building's frame when the walls haven't gone up yet. The appeal to the children was the load-bearing wall. The mention of attorney's fees was the window that let in just enough light to make the room look welcoming. "No," I said. He blinked. "Caroline." "No, everything goes through Robert Hensley." Dennis stood there for a moment, and I watched him recalibrate. He was looking for another angle. I could almost see him searching. Then he straightened, nodded once with the dignity of a man pretending he'd expected this answer, and walked away. Patricia, I later learned from Dana, had called the probate court in Phoenix twice in the 10 days following the filing, once to request procedural information, once to speak with someone Dana described as a low-level clerk who apparently had no authority over anything. It was reconnaissance. She was watching, taking measurements, deciding where to apply pressure next. But the weeks that followed her visit to my kitchen were quieter than I expected. No more cars in the driveway, no more phone calls to my cell, just the procedural drumbeat of legal filings arriving through Robert's office, each one answered in kind, each one moving the case forward on its rails. It was Dana who noticed I was fraying. She came over on a Thursday evening with wine I barely touched and takeout Thai that I ate too fast, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You're holding yourself so tightly you're going to crack a rib." She was right. I had been performing composure so consistently that I'd stopped checking what was underneath it. She recommended someone, a therapist named Dr. Anita Rowe, who worked out of an office near the university. I was resistant in the way people are when they've spent years believing that managing alone is a moral virtue. But I went. Dr. Rowe had a corner office with too many plants and a very good chair. She did not tell me what to feel. She did not suggest I forgive Dennis, or understand Patricia, or be grateful the money had arrived at all. What she did, session by session, was help me locate the difference between anger that was motivating and anger that was consuming, and showed me how to stay on the right side of that line. "You're not trying to punish them," she said during our second session. "No," I said. "I'm trying to make it right." "Do you know the difference?" "I think I do," I said. And then, after a moment, "I know the difference more each week." There was Dana, who texted every 2 or 3 days with small, normalizing things, memes about attorneys, updates about her own life, the occasional question about Emma and Jake that reminded me I was still a person with a daily life, not just a plaintiff. There was Dr. Rowe, who helped me stay sane, and there was Robert Hensley, who called every Friday afternoon with a brief, methodical update, always ending with the same sentence: "We're on track." Was I afraid? Yes. Every morning when I woke up, for exactly the first 60 seconds before I was fully conscious, I was afraid. And then I remembered where I was standing, and I got up. They came on a Sunday afternoon in December, 2 weeks before the first major pretrial hearing. I heard the doorbell, and when I opened the door, they were both there. Dennis and Patricia, standing on my porch in the thin winter light. Patricia was holding a foil-covered dish. The gesture was so precisely calibrated that it almost made me want to laugh. "We come bearing casserole. Surely you cannot serve legal papers upon someone who has brought casserole." "We wanted to see the kids," Dennis said. His voice had the warmth he used for situations that required it, a deployable warmth, not a natural one. Emma and Jake were upstairs. They were adjusting to the new geography of the household with the careful resilience of children who understand more than they're supposed to. I had told them only that their father and I were working through some important decisions. I had not told them about the money. I had not told them about the fraud. Children carry what you put on them, whether you intend it or not, and I was very deliberate about what I asked them to carry. "The kids are busy right now," I said. "You can schedule time through the arrangement we discussed with the attorneys." Patricia smiled. It was the smile I had seen 100 times at family dinners, pleasant, thin, and absolute. "Caroline," she said, "we didn't come to argue. We came because this has gone far enough, and we think you know it." She moved forward just slightly, not quite crossing the threshold, but making it clear she intended to. I did not step aside. We stood there in the doorway, 2 women who understood each other completely and had never once admitted it, with a casserole dish between us and 15 years of silence underneath everything. "I think," Patricia said, setting the dish down on the porch railing without breaking eye contact, "that you are a woman who has spent her entire life making practical decisions. You've always been practical. It's one of your qualities." The compliment landed the way her compliments always did, like a hand resting on your shoulder that is also, imperceptibly, pressing down. And the practical reality is this: Raymond's estate is complicated. The probate court in Arizona takes time. Your attorneys are expensive. Your children are watching their family be dismantled. And at the end of all of it, after the fees and the depositions and the years of waiting, you will get what a judge decides you deserve, which may be considerably less than what you imagine. She paused. I waited. "Or," she said, "you drop the fraud complaint. You negotiate a settlement with Dennis directly. Generous, I promise you that. And everyone goes on with their lives. Emma and Jake have a family that functions. You have financial security. And none of the very uncomfortable things that are going to come out in discovery need to come out." Uncomfortable things. There it was. The threat dressed in neutral language, the knife slipped in sideways so it didn't look like a knife. "What uncomfortable things?" I asked. Patricia looked at me with the patience of someone who has spent decades winning. "You've made some choices over the years, Carolyn. Financially, professionally, Choices that, taken out of context, might raise questions about your judgment, questions a custody evaluation might find relevant. My children. She was threatening to use my children. Dennis, standing just behind her, said nothing. He had the expression of a man watching a controlled demolition he had helped design, but no longer had the stomach to observe directly. He looked at the porch railing. He looked at his shoes. He did not look at me. And in that avoidance, I read something I hadn't expected. Not contempt, but shame. Real shame. The private kind that doesn't perform itself for anyone. It didn't make me softer toward him. But it confirmed something Robert had said early on. The weakest link in any conspiracy is the person who convinced himself he had good reasons. I breathed once, slowly. "Patricia," I said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully because I'm only going to say this once." My voice was level. I had practiced this, not with words, but with something older than words. The same steadiness I'd found on those Hocking Hills trails, the same ground I came back to every morning in those 60 seconds before full consciousness. Every conversation we have from this point forward is potentially part of the court record. Every threat you make, every implication, every casserole dish. I looked at her steadily. So if you have something to say to me, say it to Robert Hensley, and if he says it's relevant, it will be in the filing. Patricia Marsh's face did something I had never seen it do in 15 years. It went rigid. Dennis touched her arm, a small, urgent gesture, and she stepped back. The casserole dish sat on the railing between us. No one moved to take it. "You're making an error," Patricia said. "Maybe," I said. "I've made them before. I'm still here." They left. Patricia walked to the car with the contained, precise stride of a woman refusing to let anyone see that she was rattled. Dennis followed 2 steps behind, a position that told me everything about how that dynamic had always worked and why I had been slow to see it. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment. The house was quiet. From upstairs, I could hear the low sound of a video game from Jake's room. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a life that was still mine. My heart was beating fast, faster than I'd admitted to myself while I was standing at that door. Custody. The word had landed somewhere real and frightening, and it was still ringing. But underneath the fear was something else. The knowledge that she had played that card because she was running low on others. Desperation has a particular shape, and I had just watched Patricia Marsh show me hers. I picked up my phone and called Robert. "They came in person," I said. "Tell me everything." The pre-trial hearing was scheduled for the 3rd Tuesday in January in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Franklin County Common Pleas Courthouse. I wore the navy wool coat, the consignment shop one, the practical one, because I had decided some time ago that I would not dress for anyone's approval. I would dress for myself. Robert had spent the preceding 2 weeks with a quiet, systematic focus that I had come to recognize as his form of high alert. He had deposed 2 witnesses from the Brecker and Associates firm in Phoenix via video conference. He had obtained certified copies of the probate intake form with Dennis's handwriting and signature. He had also, through a request I hadn't anticipated, obtained the phone records showing 11 calls between Dennis's cell number and the Brecker firm between April and September 2020, the exact window during which my contact information had been falsified. Sandra Pruitt had prepared separately on the divorce side, documenting the financial fraud as a marital claim and ensuring the custody threat Patricia had made on my doorstep was captured and preserved. Dana had been there that afternoon. I had asked her to come over for coffee, and Dana had a very good memory and had signed an affidavit without my having to ask. That detail, Dana sitting at my kitchen table with her tea, close enough to hear every word Patricia had said about custody evaluations and uncomfortable things, had been deliberate. I had learned, somewhere in the months between that March bank visit and this January courtroom, that preparation is not paranoia. It is simply paying attention before you need to. Dennis's attorney was a man named Gerald Cole, who had the expensive haircut and aggressive affect of someone who billed by confidence as much as by hour. Patricia had retained her own separate counsel, a woman from a firm in Dublin, Ohio, who specialized in estate and probate disputes. I sat at the plaintiff's table and watched them arrange themselves across the room. Dennis did not look at me. Patricia looked at me exactly once, the same even, assessing look she had given me for 15 years, and then looked away. I noticed that her hands, folded on the table in front of her, were not entirely still. The judge was the Honorable Margaret Ossie, who had the bearing of someone who found theatrics irritating and facts clarifying. She ran her courtroom the way a good engineer runs a system, with zero tolerance for noise that wasn't load-bearing. Gerald Cole opened by arguing that the fraud complaint was predicated on a misunderstanding, that Dennis had provided an alternative contact address at the request of the estate attorneys themselves, who had struggled to reach me through my previous addresses. He was smooth. He was practiced. And he had just introduced a claim that Robert had specifically prepared for. "Your Honor," Robert said, rising without urgency, "if Mr. Cole is asserting that the Brecker firm requested an alternative address, I have here certified email correspondence from that firm, dated June 2020, in which they explicitly state, and I quote, that they already had Mrs. Marsh's current address on file and were not requesting any update." He laid the documents on the clerk's desk. Mr. Marsh provided a new address without being asked. The documentation shows this clearly. Gerald Cole's smoothness developed a hairline crack. What followed was methodical, and to anyone watching from the outside, probably tedious. But to me, sitting at that table, it was the most riveting 2 hours of my life. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that Patricia's 2020 contest of the estate had been a legitimate legal challenge based on concerns about Raymond Calloway's mental competency at the time of drafting, a challenge she had withdrawn voluntarily once she was satisfied those concerns were unfounded. It was technically a defensible position. Patricia herself sat with extraordinary stillness through this portion of the argument, and I understood that stillness for what it was, the discipline of a woman who knew the next 60 seconds would determine everything and was rationing every flicker of expression. Until Robert produced the correspondence between Patricia and Dennis from the spring of 2020, obtained through the pre-trial discovery process, in which Patricia wrote, in an email with her own account and her own name, "Ours lawyers don't know she's moved. Keep it that way for now. She won't look for something she doesn't know exists." The courtroom went very quiet. Patricia Marsh, across the room, looked at that document on the judge's screen, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked her age. The stillness she had maintained shattered in one small, visible way. Her chin dropped, just slightly, just for a second, before she pulled it back. She leaned toward her attorney and whispered something, and her attorney's expression told me the whisper was not helpful. Dennis, for his part, had gone the color Kevin the teller had gone that day in the bank, drained, white, still. His attorney touched his arm and he sat up straighter, but the posture was performance now, nothing underneath it. I watched him look at the email on the screen and then look away, and I thought, he is seeing, for the first time, what it looks like from the outside. Not a careful plan, not protection, just a man who had watched his wife struggle and said nothing in writing because his mother had told him to. "Your Honor," Gerald Cole said with diminished conviction, "the email can be interpreted in multiple—" "Mr. Cole," Judge Osei said, in the tone of a person who has very little interest in multiple interpretations, "I've read it." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. To me, it felt like the ending of something very long. Judge Osei did not rule from the bench that day. That was not how these things worked, and I had been prepared not to expect it. But Robert walked out of the courtroom with the measured energy of a man who knows which way a river is running, and he said simply, "That went well," which from Robert Hensley was the equivalent of anyone else throwing a parade. The ruling came 6 weeks later. I was at work. I was still going to work every day because the inheritance was frozen pending litigation, and because I had learned long ago that routine was an anchor, not a limitation. When Robert called at 2:14 in the afternoon, "I want you to sit down before I read it," he said. I was already sitting. I told him so. He read. The court found that Dennis Raymond Marsh had willfully and deliberately provided false contact information to the estate of Raymond Calloway with the intent to delay or prevent his spouse's notification of a material inheritance. The court further found that Patricia Ann Marsh had, through documented correspondence, conspired to maintain that concealment. Both findings were referred to the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office in Arizona for review of potential criminal fraud charges. On the divorce side, Sandra Pruitt had argued that because the fraud constituted deliberate concealment of marital assets, even assets Dennis himself had no legal claim to, the court should consider this in the equitable distribution. Judge Osei agreed. The settlement structure Sandra had proposed, which Dennis's attorney had resisted fiercely through 3 rounds of negotiation, was largely upheld. I retained the house, received a significant portion of the marital assets accumulated over 15 years, and retained primary physical custody of Emma and Jake, with Dennis receiving scheduled visitation. The $31,400,208.17 was mine, fully, legally, uncontestably mine. The protective order was lifted. The accounts were cleared. I sat at my desk for a full minute after Robert finished reading, with the phone still in my hand and the fluorescent light of the dental office humming above me, and I thought about the $6,000 I had walked into that bank to pay. I thought about the way Kevin the teller had gone pale. I thought about all the February heating bills my mother had juggled and the coupons under the single bulb, and every morning I had woken up afraid for exactly 60 seconds. All of it had led here, to this fluorescent-lit Tuesday, to this number that was finally, irrevocably, mine. As for Patricia's threat, the uncomfortable things she had implied during that December Sunday, the suggestion that my financial history might reflect poorly on my fitness as a mother, Sandra had responded to that line of attack before it had ever been formally raised, presenting a comprehensive picture of my financial management during the marriage that demonstrated clearly that the household's chronic deficits were attributable to documented overspending by Dennis, not mismanagement by me. The custody evaluator who had been appointed found no concerns. Patricia's gambit had cost her exactly nothing on my side, because I had nothing to hide, and had cost her a great deal on hers, because attempting to weaponize a custody evaluation without cause is the kind of move that judges remember. Gerald Cole submitted one further motion after the ruling, a request for reconsideration based on new evidence that turned out to be neither new nor particularly evidential. Judge Osei denied it in 2 sentences. The referral to the Maricopa County District Attorney's Office was the piece that moved slowly, the way criminal proceedings always do, but it moved. By the following spring, Dennis had received a target letter. Patricia's estate attorney in Dublin had quietly withdrawn from her representation. A plea negotiation had begun that I was not party to and did not need to be. Dennis called me once, 2 days after the ruling. I let it go to voicemail. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped I could believe that. He said he didn't know it would go this far. There was a long pause at the end of the message, the kind that happens when someone has more to say and understands that none of it will help. Then the voicemail ended. Didn't know it would go this far. Not that it was wrong, not that he had understood what he was doing to me, only that he hadn't anticipated the distance the stone would travel once he had thrown it. I have thought about that voicemail many times since. It is the most honest thing Dennis ever said to me, and it is still not an apology. Not really. An apology requires understanding the harm. What he expressed was surprise at the consequences. Those are not the same thing. I did not call him back. What I did instead, the evening after Robert called with the ruling, was drive to the school where Emma had her winter choir concert. I sat in a folding chair in a gymnasium that smelled of sneakers and floor wax, and I watched my daughter stand in the second row in her blue dress and sing with 11-year-old seriousness, and the lights were too bright and the acoustics were terrible, and I thought, I am here. I showed up. I stayed in one piece long enough to sit in this chair and watch this. That was enough. It was, actually, more than enough. I paid the mortgage when I got home. The full balance, the entirety of what we'd owed, closed out. The account balance afterward was still a number I would never entirely believe, but I believed it. Spring came that year with the particular extravagance of springs that follow hard winters, the kind where the forsythia seems almost aggressive in its yellowness, as if it has something to prove. I noticed it. I had not noticed a spring properly in years. I left the dental office job in April, not with drama, but with gratitude. I gave 3 weeks' notice, brought cake on my last day, and shook hands with Dr. Pellegrino, who had been a decent employer for 11 years and deserved to know he had been one. The bookkeeping job I kept for now, not because I needed the income, but because Robert's financial advisors had strongly recommended I make no large changes to my visible lifestyle until all proceedings were fully concluded, and because I found, somewhat to my surprise, that I still liked the work. Numbers made sense in a way that people often didn't. I hired an independent financial advisor, a woman named Christine Yu, who worked out of a small firm in Worthington and who had been recommended by Dana after careful research. Christine was meticulous and direct. She sat with me for 2 full hours on our first meeting, asking questions with the patience of someone who genuinely expected the answers to matter. And at the end, she said, "You've spent a long time managing scarcity. That's a skill. We're going to redirect it." Over the following months, under Christine's guidance, I established a diversified investment portfolio. I created a trust for Emma and Jake's education that required nothing from them except that they try in good faith. I donated a portion, a meaningful portion, a portion my mother would have considered absurd, to a family shelter in Dayton, the city where she had clipped coupons under a single bulb, because some gestures are for the dead as much as for the living. I bought a new house, not enormous, not performative, a craftsman bungalow in Clintonville, with a deep porch and a yard large enough for a garden I had always wanted and never had the space for. Emma chose the paint color for her room. Jake chose the basketball hoop for the driveway. I chose the kitchen, which had north-facing windows and enough counter space that cooking felt like a pleasure rather than a calculation. Dr. Rowe and I continued to meet bi-weekly, then monthly. She was, I told her once, the best 40 minutes a week I had ever spent on myself. She received this without false modesty and said only, "You did the work." And there was Dana, who texted every few days with small normalizing things and reminded me, without trying to, that I was still a person with a daily life and not just a plaintiff. And Dennis? The plea agreement came in October. 2 counts of fraud-related charges, a substantial fine, and 3 years of probation. His employer conducted an internal review upon learning of it and terminated his contract. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Westerville and took a contract position with a smaller company at a considerably reduced salary. He saw Emma and Jake on his scheduled weekends, and from what the children told me, those visits were quiet. He was trying, I thought, in his limited way, genuinely trying. I did not hate him anymore. Hating requires an investment of attention I preferred to spend elsewhere. Patricia was a different story. The email, her email with her name on it, read aloud in a courtroom, had consequences she had not modeled in any of her careful calculations. Her standing in the social circles she had maintained for decades shifted in the subtle, devastating way of communities that do not forgive publicly. She was not criminally charged. The DA's office ultimately found that the evidence against Dennis was more actionable than the evidence against Patricia, whose involvement, while documented, stopped short of the direct falsification of documents. But she knew what she had done, and more importantly, she knew that the people around her now knew it too. I heard through Dana, almost a year later, that Patricia had sold her house and moved to Scottsdale, starting over in the desert at 71. Was I glad? I examined the question honestly. No. Glad would have required me to care, and I had stopped caring about Patricia Marsh sometime around the moment I sat in a choir concert gymnasium and understood what I was actually fighting for. I cared about Emma singing in her blue dress. I cared about Jake's basketball hoop. I cared about north-facing windows and a garden in Clintonville, and a friend named Dana who texted on random Wednesdays about nothing and everything. That was more than enough. That was a life. What would you have done, sitting across from that bank teller, watching the number change everything? Leave a comment below. I read everyone. Thank you, truly, for listening to my story.